Okay, Leonardo DiCaprio. Let's talk about teaching Leo gay history. You took him to meet Frank Kameny and kind of opened up his world, I'm sure. Talk about how you went about opening him up to that world.
Well, I mean, I think, Leo knows about, all kinds of history. We all know what it's like to be, gay, or what gay people are going through, and he has gay friends and family, I'm sure. But really what we both need to discover was what was it like to be gay in Hoover's time.
Right.
It's a very different thing.
Yeah.
I mean, first and foremost, the word gay didn't exist yet. I mean, not as we define it now. The word gay was found in all the songs of the day, and it meant you were having a great time. Homosexual wasn't used the way it is today. There really was no good word for it. It was still, like Oscar Wilde said, this love that dare not speak its name. And so I thought it was important to go meet some of these guys living in Washington, D.C., who grew up pre-sexual revolution, pre-Stonewall, and ask them about what the rules were. What did it look like to be gay back in that day? And I brought Leo with me, and he came with me and met with Frank Kameny, who was one of the early civil rights, really one of the founders of the gay movement in Washington, D.C., and he was in his 80s. He's since passed away. But
what was that like talking to him? What was the conversation like?
Well, I mean, a lot of it was about what were the rules and what did it look like. And granted, Frank was the exception to many of these rules because he actually started to speak out, but he knew everyone else, and he could sort of give us a window into, how other people were operating. And it was upsetting to me because it seemed as if, you really couldn't talk about it, even in the privacy of your own home. Even if you were just with the other person you cared about. It was just too dangerous. It really meant losing your family and your life. Absolutely. You would be unemployable. You would lose the people you love in your world. And it was just too dangerous. And that means that oftentimes if it was consummated, that meant the end of that friendship, that relationship. Because it was just so dangerous. And to me, it started to match up exactly with J. Edgar Hoover and with his behavior, his workaholism, his focus on public admiration over love, and this pattern that he had with Clyde Tolson. I mean, they were showing up to work together every morning, going home every night in the same car, and this is way before carpooling was popular.
Right.
But, it was never discussed, it was never open, and really there's very little proof of confirmation. And that's probably because it looked incredibly different then than it did now. And that was important for me to know, and certainly for Leonardo.
Yeah. And you don't have any doubt. I mean, for you, they were in some kind of romantic.
Yeah, I think they were in a very loving. I think they loved each other, and I think that these were not heterosexual men. Yeah. I mean, if they were the worst heterosexual men ever. It doesn't make any sense. They had people from Dorothy Lamour to Ginger and Leela Rogers throwing themselves at them. They talk about that in their books. It never worked out well. Right. I mean, these were, especially Clyde Tolson, an incredibly attractive guy. J. Edgar Hoover was not bad looking in his 20s. They had every opportunity to build a life.
Right.
And just never did. And, some of the most telling stuff was that they would go on vacations together and share these hotel rooms. And there's one very infamously overheard fight that's portrayed in the film that certainly went beyond a fight over misplaced files. And really, the photographs of them together at these retreats and these vacations are incredibly intimate. They're wearing matching suits. They're always touching leg to leg, hand to hand. And probably some of the most compelling photographs are the collection of photos that J. Edgar Hoover took of Clyde Tolson sleeping, which to me just says this is probably not just, these aren't just pals. There's something else going on here.
Well, I noticed in your film is an amazing sense of empathy for J. Edgar. And, talk about discovering that empathy for him. For you, Dustin Lance Black.
To find empathy for a man who tortured gay and lesbian people, and really anybody who had a secret. It's tough. It was tough, but I did find myself, especially when I was in looking at his younger years, and I'm reading things that his mother put in there. I'm reading about what he went through as a young man, and I certainly related. Having grown up in a Mormon household in Texas in a military home, very conservative at the time, and I related to him, and so you start to feel for him, and it is difficult because I know where he's headed, and I know what he becomes, and I know the great ill that he did to my community and to this country eventually, and so that's tough. But I think it's for the greater good. And I think that if we don't understand why and don't feel for why he became what he became, then we can't prevent it.
Right.
And to me, it's as simple as when these young people say, I have feelings for this person, or my love goes this direction, that you can't tell them that that love has no value. Because then they unfortunately might listen to you and replace it with something else, and replace it with fame, like J. Edgar Hoover did, replace it with public admiration, something you shouldn't hold on to for too long. And it is worrisome. It worries me because in these polls, there's a very recent poll that asked young people in this country, what do you want to do with your life? What's your number one ambition?
Yeah.
And it had always been in history, be a doctor, be an actor, cure cancer, things that might lead to fame or money. But now it's simple. Now it's the number one answer is fame. Right. Fame for fame's sake. And I do think it's incredibly dangerous, and it does not bode well for our country and our society. And so in that way, I think we need to understand what that is, and we need to understand that that void we create in these young people and that sense of ambition for fame's sake is dangerous, and it can create a whole generation of little Hoovers, and we don't want that.
On YouTube, no less.
You little YouTube Hoovers. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, just to extrapolate and to guess a little bit, talk about if Harvey Milk and J. Edgar Hoover were both alive today, how might they be responding to all this Occupy Wall Street and this Occupy Everywhere business that's going on globally right now?
Well, very differently, probably. Unless, I mean, young Harvey Milk might have agreed with, young Harvey Milk was a conservative Republican Wall Street guy. So, he would have been quite upset. But, post Harvey, burning his draft card and moving to San Francisco, I think he would be right there with them. But, J. Edgar Hoover would have seen it as radicalism. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, he labeled anything that looked radical. Communism. So all of you would be communists right now. Yeah. You can certainly listen.
Listening to KRCL 90.9 FM. This is Radioactive and Troy Williams here with Dustin Lance Black, who has just written the new Clint Eastwood directed film, J. Edgar. Let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about the American Foundation for Equal Rights. What's happening with AFAIR right now?
With AFAIR, so the case against Proposition 8, the federal case against Proposition 8.
Right, which you have been instrumental in pulling everybody together.
Well, I'm one of the four founders of the case, but I'm not one of the plaintiffs. Back there. We have a few more weeks to wait before the California Supreme Court gives their opinion on whether the interveners, the people, the plaintiffs in this case, the defendants in this case, have the right to argue the case. And so we're waiting for that, and the Ninth Circuit will then listen to that opinion and make their own decision about standing. And then finally, we get to have the case heard on merits.
Right.
And so we're really very very close to that, and we'll be seeing where it goes from there. I can say that at AFAIR, we will not stop this fight until it gets to the U.S. Supreme Court.
All right.
And we do believe that this is the best case to get there, so that is what we're pushing for, and that this is a good court to hear it.
Right.
And that decision, and people should know, because you should be interested in every state in this country, that once that decision is made by the U.S. Supreme Court, that's not just marriage in California, that's marriage in all 50 states.
Right.
And it also sets the precedent that the 14th Amendment applies to everyone, including all of LGBT people.
Right.
Yes.
All right. Very cool. Well, let's go ahead and wrap things up. I want to turn the microphone over to anybody in our studio audience who might want to ask a question about the film or about AFAIR or LGBT issues nationally, globally. Dustin Lance Black can answer anything. He knows everything.
I talked to you about this screenplay probably a year ago, and that was addressing the cross-dressing issue. And there was one interesting film, and I thought you handled it, the sort of rumors, I think, really well. It sort of fit into the film, but it was sort of an awkward moment at the same time. So what sort of, I guess, pushback have you gotten on that particular issue?
No pushback yet, but I in my research, it became clear that J. Edgar Hoover was not a cross-dresser. if he had been, it would have been fabulous. I would have enjoyed it and tried to make that not an attack. You know, we could have embraced that and figured that out. But that quickly fell apart, and the one person who made that accusation, and that is how she made it, was as an accusation, as an attack. Her story quickly falls apart. It doesn't really make sense. It doesn't hold water. That he'd be where she says he was when she says he was there in a dress. And so, but that became the mythology, and I thought, boy, you know, to not address it at all, because every time I told someone I'm doing the J. Edgar Hoover movie, the first question is, what kind of dress are you putting him in? And so I thought, I'd kind of like to hit this head on in a way. And so I found the moment that I thought he was at his most vulnerable, and his most emotionally vulnerable. In the moment I thought he might have thought, maybe now I could perhaps embrace my true self, embrace my nature. And that was the moment his mother died, because his mother had been such a positive and negative influence in his life. And I had him put on her dress. And in that way, it's an expression of his feelings for her, but also that little bit of hope, that little idea that maybe he could embrace himself. And I hope in that way it flips it, and it's no longer an accusation, but it's a window into this man's quite tortured soul. And so far, no pushback about that, except I think some reviewers have been upset that I don't show him. You know, some reviewers have been very upset that I don't go into the things that I found to be false in research. And I kind of expected that to happen. Doesn't mean it feels good, but you know, when Rex Reed gets angry that you didn't put him in a ball gown, you're like, well, that's because he was never in a ball gown. Go do your research, Rex.
Not necessarily a question, but a comment that your take on J. Edgar was sort of a narrative of to be aware of the abuse of power. What I took away from this film was sort of a celebration of this visionary that had the foresight and, you know, for lack of a better description, the balls to go forward and say, you know what, this organization, the FBI, needs these powers to be a satisfactory law enforcement agency of the government, and we need this. And he fought against presidents, Congress. He was a visionary, and the FBI, you know, some people would say, oh, they abuse their power, but for the most part, they're a pretty good operation for this country. That's what I took away from it. Not as sort of a cautionary tale, but sort of a telling of this guy's story, that he was a visionary and he was...
Well, that's the other side to it. I mean, you have to take the good and the bad, and certainly the country had outgrown this idea that only states should be able to enforce, to prosecute crimes that happen in their states, and that's what, there was a big problem. It was a problem. People were robbing banks in Texas and crossing the state line to Oklahoma, and you could just sit there and make fun of the cops across the road, and you were a free person. And he was a visionary in that way, in understanding that you needed to have a federal system so that that sort of crime stopped, and he was able to stop it. It's sometimes just the questions of the means with which he did some of these things weren't quite honest. But, you know, certainly in terms of crime solving, he was a great visionary. Having this belief in fingerprinting, which a lot of people did not, knowing that it needed to be centralized, and then really being the guy who had the belief in forensics and science, and believing that really you could enter that into court of law and win. All of that was revolutionary. I'm telling you, if the man had just quit in 1940, we would be celebrating him as one of the greatest Americans. But he would not let go. He wouldn't let go because it was all he had. And that's where the darkness starts. And that's why this film is told in 2 parts. It's not a 70-year span. It's 10 years in the beginning when he was doing great work. Not always being totally honest about the means with which he was gaining power, but he was doing great work that really helped this country. And then in his later years, where he wouldn't let go, and he was still using those same methods, but now not for such good. Sure. And so you have to show both sides, and it is a little bit gray, and some will criticize that as muddled, but I think it's fair, and I think it's more honest.
Great. All right, Dustin Lance Black, thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you very
much. Great. J. Edgar is now in theaters, and you can follow Lance at DustinLanceBlack.com. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you all. Great.